Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Pentecost with APA Virginia staff. Thank you for joining us for our monthly webinar series, Your Hour with APA Virginia, sponsored by the Berkeley Group. And I'm just gonna hang out for a couple minutes, wait for people to get in here. This is gonna be one of our most popular webinars. So thank you for those of us, or for those of you who joined us today. And again, thank you for the Berkeley Group for making this possible. We have a pretty far-reaching attendance today. I see we have people from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. I see we also have someone joining us from New Zealand. So welcome. This webinar series is the fourth Monday of every month, happening from noon to 1 p.m. And they're currently free and open to anybody. You don't have to be a member of APA or even of our chapter. And if you watch it live, you're eligible for a CM credit, and that's on apavirginia.com. You can find the info and also be on the lookout for a follow-up email today with that information. And just give people a couple more minutes to join in here. You'll see on the screen that APA Virginia is bringing back their one-day symposium this year. It's going to be in downtown Lynchburg on April 9th. We'd love to see some of you there. We just announced Evelyn Sloan of Hill Studio and Chuck Dupree of Downtown Economics as keynote speakers. And we released all the speaker names and the sessions on our website at apavirginia.com if you're interested. It's a good way to get some CM credits if you can't make it to the National Planning Conference. It's happening the week just before. And registration is open. It's $55 a person, just an easy one-day event. And we've also announced our annual conference at Winter Green, July 22nd through the 25th. This year's theme is Mountains of Influence. So far we've announced mobile tours, plenary speakers, and a preliminary schedule as well. So you can head on over again to apavirginia.com. And registration opens this Friday. So be on the lookout for that. If you're a member, you'll get a newsletter in your email. You can look at it on Facebook, Twitter. We'll be announcing it everywhere. And we've got some exciting things planned. It's our last planned year at Winter Green, so we want to make it fun for everybody. It's our last time being on the mountain. So we hope to see you there. And for those of you who just joined us, thank you for joining us for Your Hour with APA Virginia, sponsored by the Berkeley Group. We have a full house today, so thank you for those of you who shared this with your colleagues and helped spread the word. These happen the fourth Monday of each month from noon to 1, covering many topics in the planning arena. And if you're interested in presenting, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is on the webinar page of apavirginia.com. Please mark your calendars for next month's webinar, April 16th. We'll have the Berkeley Group themselves partnering with Kim Lundgren Associates. They'll be presenting Inspiring the Community to Action using storytelling to report on community health. You can sign up on our website. Today, we have a very exciting webinar. We have the co-editors of a newly released Island Press book called Suburban Remix, Creating the Next Generation of Urban Places. And so as we go along, feel free to type questions in the questions box. We'll do all questions at the end. We'll just save that for last. CM credit info is available on the webinar page, and it will be in the follow-up email to this webinar. And we will also post the recording to our YouTube page within 24 hours. So if you know people who couldn't make it in today, or you want to use this as a resource later on, check back to our YouTube page. And a little bit about our presenters today. Jason Besky, he's AICP. He's an urban planner and urban designer with public and private experience and a frequent speaker and instructor at planning conferences, including our own. His preferred diet is chips and salsa. And he is from the DC area. So close by to us, our other presenter, David Dixon. He's FAIA, leads planning and urban design for Stantec's Urban Places, an interdisciplinary team that helps cities and suburbs alike thrive by harnessing the growing demand for urban life. His work has won national awards from the AIA, CNU, International Downtown Association, and ASLA. He is co-author of Urban Design for an Urban Century, Placemaking for People, which was first published by Wiley in 2009. And again, this webinar is in partnership with Island Press. They are the publisher of David and Jason's new book. And I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to David, and we will get started.
Okay. Terrific. Thank you for those introductions. And I have to apologize to everybody. I have a cold, which unfortunately you're going to be aware of as I do this. I also want to particularly thank whoever has signed up and tuned in from New Zealand. I'm actually in Sydney, Australia right now, and it's 3 a.m. So anybody who, I understand why somebody gets up at this hour to give a webinar, but to attend one is particularly impressive. So thank you. I'm going to dive right in here, and that's in part so we can work through the content, and I hope have some time for questions. Jason and I decided to do this book a number of years ago. Writing a book while having a job is not the best way to get a book done, so it's taken a while, but in a way that's been good because we've learned a lot. And we've learned a lot, in particular from the work we're doing. Excuse me. One of the things that, statements that was really stuck in my mind is some comment by a fellow in the audience, part of our community group we're working with in Roanoke County, just outside of Roanoke, Virginia, looking at turning the Tanglewood Mall into a walkable, livable, mixed-use community center, community center. And this fellow raised his hand and said, "So I get it. North America is a suburban continent with an urban population." And I thought he really captured what has gone on and gone on relatively suddenly in all our lives and created challenges, but also a degree of opportunity that means we're not at the end of suburbs or at peak suburb. We're at a point of fundamental change in our suburbs, and that are creating opportunities that we haven't seen in our lifetime. And so that's what we're here to talk about. I want to thank the contributors to our book. And I won't read the list. I'll call out Sir Stuart Schwartz, who heads the Smart Growth Alliance in Washington, in the Washington, D.C. region. But most of these folks have actually done, or certainly majority, great work in and around Northern Virginia and the D.C. region, and have helped make it the place that it is today. The agenda we're going to cover begins with sort of the Great Reset, the disruptive changes that have gone on, and then, while clearly these have created fundamental shocks for suburbs and set the stage for dramatic changes, really focus on the opportunity, the urban opportunity that these changes are creating for suburbs and will continue to create, and probably with greater force well into the 2040s than they are today. Talk about the thresholds that are required to really trigger positive change. Jason will, I'll do much of this. Jason will then finish by talking about sort of the principles and placemaking that turn these into great places for people and the real centers for our communities. So let's start with the Great Reset. This is a little bit before the Great Reset. This is an image from New Rochelle, New York, of how we envisioned our suburbs, our very romanticized early visions. Much of this suburban movement took off across the country, certainly in Florida, produced wonderful arts and crafts cottages, and we have to all remember a legacy that in many places that we can be very, very proud of. It also performed an absolutely essential role to house an exploding middle class after World War II, and frankly enabled things like white flight that we are not so proud of today, but are part of this history. Early suburbs grew. Levittowns at one point represented something like 15% of all housing production in the U.S. in any particular year. They became grander and more complex. This suburb in Florida we're working now truly wishes that they had not designed around all this water, which is now proceeding to rise, nor are they happy with the golf course over in the right-hand corner, because golf courses are no longer the kind of attraction that they used to be, and actually, frankly, they're looking for reuse for that golf course. And of course, Northern Virginia has a very proud tradition of a transition to suburbs that is well ahead of most of the rest of the U.S. and where much of the rest of the U.S. wishes they were today. The excuse me, the Great Recession, 2008 to 2011, really peeled back any veneer of normalcy that was covering the fundamental changes that had gone on pretty rapidly and with increasing impact in our society and in the preceding probably 10, even fewer years, and quickly changed, I think, our vision for what a suburb meant. So this romanticized vision of New Rochelle was replaced by how New Rochelle wants to show us today is its vision of its sort of new urban heart as a still vibrant and vital and relevant suburb for, and of course you can figure out that's New York in the background. So what's happened? Well, if you look at this slide, look at the image on the left. 1990 should really read probably 1950, because for virtually every decade from the end of World War II until fairly recently, most of our growth was 35 to 65-year-olds. These are folks who are in their prime years for buying houses, having kids, buying lots of cars, shaping the world that we've all lived in and worked in, and as planners, given us the tools that we have to work with. Starting in the late, starting with really 2000 on, this pattern shifted dramatically, and you have to understand that. Stop to think about how fundamental this is. That means that people who had lived their lives from the because they were born in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, et cetera, and we're used to seeing America grow in a certain way and markets perform in a certain way, are suddenly now, all of us living in a world where our demographics are very different, and therefore our markets are going to perform very different. So today, and going well into the 2040s, most of our growth, the majority of our growth is going to be folks over 65, and folks 35 to 65 represent actually the smallest chunk of our growth. Now we have to remember, it's not it's not how many 35 to 65-year-olds, for example, there are who shape a market. It's how is that segment growing? We've already built the houses, the offices, the cars, et cetera, that these folks want if they've been around for a while. It is the new households that are appearing that really shape markets, and therefore the world around us going forward. Well, closely related to this, between 1970 and 2030, our dear country will have added, if you're listening in the U.S., 170 million people between over a 60-year period, all of whom roughly all of whom, of which 2 million will have been school-age kids, meaning the other 168 million weren't school-age kids And the implications of this are basically that we stopped growing as households with kids and we're growing as singles and couples. So when I grew up, and you can get a sense of how old I am, this is what I was told the world looked like when I turned on television, and it certainly rang true. Today, if we turn on popular media, this is what we're told we look like, and that's because we have dramatically changed. So going forward, well again into the 2040s, 75 to 85% of all net new households in North America, not just US. And actually, I've just come from a sort of a speaking tour in New Zealand. These numbers are even truer in New Zealand and Australia. This is data for the developed world, not just the US, North America. While the primary market for single-family detached houses, the natural market is households with 2 adults and kids who used to dominate markets and dominated growth for so long. By 2025, 10% of US households will be include 2 adults with kids. Another 15% will include a single adult with kids, and there are other issues that we really need to think about. But fundamentally, in the story for today is just the dramatic shift in who we are as households, and therefore the fundamental demand for housing markets. There's going to be more to the story in a minute going forward. The night and day reversal in who we are and what we want, and who we are, and therefore where we're going to want to live, which we'll talk some more about. At the same time, and you've heard a lot about this, the share of U.S. income owned by middle class really is shrinking. Their implications for suburbs are probably obvious because they're considered sort of middle class communities. But this has had there's a particular edge to this. More affluent households, those that are gaining in their share of wealth, are moving into urban cores. So not only are richer people moving into urban cores, but they're richer than they used to be when they moved into urban cores. So that the top 40% of US households by income, and these are the households that are actually gaining in relative wealth compared to the rest of us, are moving into urban cores. At the same time, and these two are clearly closely related as pieces of information, 25 to 49-year-olds, and this is almost basically anybody, but what really matters here for our economy is the age range I'm talking about. With 4 years or more of education are moving into urban cores. Anybody 25 to 49 with less than 4 years of education is actually probably moving out of an urban core today. It's not just because it's folks with college degrees who care more about a main street than a backyard. It's because, frankly, their incomes are higher and they can afford to move into cores. There's been some talk for a while that we have not reached peak suburb, quote unquote, because the same number of millennials live in suburbs today as did 20 years ago. The dramatic difference is the education levels of the millennials who lived in the US in our suburbs 20 years ago versus those who live in cities today. Millennials in suburbs used to be more educated than those in cities. That has dramatically reversed and is heading steadily in the other direction. So more education, more income, more urban. That means that today, if you look at broadly whole US housing stock, more than 60% is single family suburban. Core demand is 22%, headed to 10%. What that means is you could say we have a surplus of certain kinds of housing, but it means that we are dramatically undersupplied with the blue portion of these two housing figures here, meaning we have a dramatic undersupply of urban housing. And not surprisingly, this has been reflected in price trends. Values are rising significantly faster in cities and suburbs. That's partly how this is equalizing itself out. These trends, particularly coming out of 2008, are even more dramatic and certainly are continuing. So we're also going through a values shift. So not only do a lot of folks care more about their smartphone than a car, but there's something else more fundamental going on. So this is an ad for Aunt Jemima pancake mix from my era. And if you look very hard at this picture, the word homogeneity may jump right out at you. This is all about a society that tends to have a fairly sort of shared view of itself. It's like the television shows I used to watch. This is an ad for mass marketer IKEA. This is not a retailer selling goods to gay couples with interracial families in cities. This is a mass marketer, and it is about the fact that homogeneity has been replaced by diversity as a value in our marketplace. And that has fundamental implications for the kinds of communities that we need to create, but are going to be able to create going forward. Another value that's shifted fundamentally is the degree to which we attach healthy lifestyles, the ability to achieve healthy lifestyles to where we're living. So, and this has to do also with fundamental, it's not just that we changed our minds, there are fundamental shifts going on in how our lives work. So in the 1990s, when fewer of us had weight problems, 50% of us had jobs that gave us enough exercise so that we didn't gain weight in life. Today, about 20% of us have jobs that give us enough exercise. So where we live has become more important for very natural reasons natural who we are. At the same time, whereas people used to call a green suburb a healthier place to live, they now call a walkable city a healthier place to live, and for obvious and I think self-aware reasons. So on the one hand, we have all these reasons shaped and driven, no pun intended, by demographics, but accelerated by values, very much accelerated by values that have created are creating a tremendous urban opportunity in cities and in suburbs. We're going to come to how to apply this in a few minutes. But there's also an imperative here that means that we can't just say, gee, this is something that's interesting. But as communities, we have to pay attention to it because folks like me have decided to get older, and at some point we leave the workforce, and because we have an aging population, our workforce is growing much more slowly. We will add fewer new workers in 2040 than we did in 2010. At the same time, the nature of the jobs we're creating has shifted, has concentrated to an extent that we've never experienced. And this is developed world again, not certainly just US. So that coming out of the recession, something like 95% of all net new jobs required a college education. Well, if you concentrate jobs all in one category, I'm sorry, this is the data for New Zealand where I was just speaking, even more dramatic. If you concentrate, excuse me, if you concentrate the nature of new jobs in one area, requires a college education or equivalent training, you dramatically decrease the supply of new workforce, you get a labor shortage. And this country is already, North America, the developed world, has already developed the developed world has developed a significant shortage of skilled and educated knowledge workers, which stands at 10% in the US today and is likely to reach 30% by the end of the next decade. Now, you can ask yourselves separately, why at a time like this, any developed country, this is what New Zealand is talking all about when I was here, would want to do anything other than encourage more immigration, but that's a side issue. Left to our own devices, we are creating a significant shortage of knowledge workers, which means that the industries that create the jobs, that create the investment that every city is seeking, excuse me, are knowledge industries, the real source of economic growth in the developed world, are now following this workforce. The most in the marketplace, the best evidence is that urban office rents have actually outperformed suburban office rents to a much more significant degree than residential rents have, residential values. And if anything, you will notice that the premium that people pay for urban office space, job space is accelerating. But what this also means is that, excuse me, I apologize for my cold, that every city and town that I work for, Stantec's Urban Places work for, that Jason works for, et cetera, is laser focused on increasing its appeal, its amenity value, its walkability, all the things that appeal to more educated, therefore more affluent, younger, but frankly of any age, workers to a knowledge workforce, because they know that the jobs and investment that they care about are following. Now, this has the inevitable effect of making urban centers in cities and suburbs alike still more wonderful, more appealing, and therefore more expensive, which is accelerating an equity crisis, which is putting a greater, there are all kinds of moral implications to this, which I will skim right over, but which have real implications for suburbs, and add to the imperative, frankly, to attract this workforce and this investment and this tax base. Poverty in U.S. suburbs between 2008 and 2016 went up by more than 50%. This is across the board. And this has all to do with the relative cost of living in a city versus a suburb, but rewire that to say the cost of living in an urban, walkable, mixed-use context versus a single-use context. Now, what that means is that suburbs, because social services are not all rushing out at this pace, believe me, nor are education systems sort of restructuring themselves for this change, are under tremendous new pressures to fund the costs of meeting these kinds of transitions. And the way to do it is to unlock the kind of centers that we've talked about. I should say this is Fairfax County. I'm sorry, actually, the data I gave was wrong. That was for Fairfax County. The data for the U.S. is 2000 to 2016 is about 60%, very similar. Fairfax County has actually attracted more than about $20 billion in new investment through by creating a series of really terrific competitive centers, which are able to sort of fund this transition. Now, before taking this to its next step, which is what do you do with all this, I want to put another piece of sort of another issue on the table here, because it's going to completely disrupt everything we're doing. This is the arrival of autonomous mobility. It's coming sooner than we think, and it's not going to look like this. It's going to look much more like this cute little fellow here called Ollie, vehicle, meaning that if we were still a society of where households with kids were making most of our decisions about where we wanted to live and work, and suburban office space was the place to be, et cetera, then lots of people would want to hop in one of these and wouldn't mind an hour and a half commute while reading a book or whatever, watching video to go home at night. but we aren't. We're a society that values main streets more than backyards, and so we want access to main streets. So, it is actually shared autonomous mobility that will unfold much sooner. Vehicles like this are in mass production this year. They're more crash-worthy, mixed traffic Piers developed by General Motors and Ford. Fiat Chrysler will be in production in about 2 years. They have all kinds of competitive advantages, which I'm not going to, we don't have the time to go into this today, but please, just for credibility, if you look at reports by folks like Morgan Stanley about the impact of shared autonomous mobility on global automobile production, basically Morgan Stanley is saying that all growth in world global automobile production after the mid to late 2020s is going to be shared autonomous, presumably electric vehicles, because they will make so much sense for the developed world, given who we are as societies and what our real mobility demands are. So what does this mean for cities? Well, shared autonomous vehicles will bring a series of, can unlock a series of dividends for urban places, whether they're in core cities, excuse me, or in suburbs, that are pretty profound and will accelerate and further enhance the trends that I've just been talking about. And the first is the amenity dividend. Jason and I gave a talk at the National Building Museum on Suburban Remix. It was great. And one thing I love about Washington, D.C. is how many great urban neighborhoods there are in the core. And in any one of them within a 5-minute walk, there are galleries, there are lofts, there are great places to work, great museums, etc. But we know, you know and experience the core of DC or of any American city or any neighborhood by a 5-minute walk, essentially. With the introduction of shared autonomous mobility, anybody will be able to an inexpensive ride, about 40%, 50% less than the cost of Uber Pool today, will be a click away if you're in a core urban area with a critical mass of people and trips, so that all the cool neighborhoods of DC, whether it's downtown, Logan Circle, H Street, will provide the amenity, the cool lofts, the cool cafes, the great brew pubs, etc., that define what is cool and great and highly amenitized and wonderful about living in urban DC. So in effect, it will enhance the competitive position of the entire urban core, and it will do the same thing for suburban centers. Think now in places like Tyson's that are developing, that won't develop as a series of 5-minute walkable districts, but as single, cohesive, competitive, walkable, highly amenitized cores. There will be a public realm dividend. The tanned area indicates the top diagram how much room we need to provide for cars on our streets today. The bottom diagram, the contrasting perspective when we have fewer vehicles if we planned for shared autonomous as opposed to a proliferation of personal autonomous vehicles in our cities, but also the fact that these vehicles can drive much closer together. I'm not going to even begin to suggest all the wonderful things that you all know you can do with the sidewalks and public right-of-way that course right-of-ways that course through our streets. The one thought I will live with is to remind all of you that this is a public resource that we are recapturing. This is public land that we can decide for what public purposes we would like to see a bold new future. The most important impact I want to talk about is the density dividend. Shared autonomous vehicles don't park. I think it is complete. I think it would be, I am sure that within 10 years, certainly maybe not too much longer, that in cities, mobility will be shared, or in urban areas, as opposed to suburbs where it will continue to be owned because it won't be as convenient, and it will just make much more sense in urban environments. That means that people, when you want to go someplace, you'll click. You won't have to go get a car that's parked. Click, ride will show up, very inexpensive, get there, etc. Get out, and you won't park. If those who drive personal autonomous vehicles are not going to drive into this parking structure and park, they're going to arrive at the entrance and say, frankly, go park yourself. That means we are probably at peak parking today or very soon, meaning our urban environments will probably never need as much parking again as we need today. Now, there's been a lot of discussion as people have begun to see this picture. It hardly takes me to figure this out. It says, well, we have to start thinking about what we're going to do with all this redundant parking. Let's make sure we build all our new parking with high bays and flat floors. In fact, parking, you can create office space out of it. You could create housing. You can create Amazon distribution centers. But what parking really does a great job as parking. What this parking is going to much more importantly allow us to do is introduce a whole new generation of density and development into an intensification into our urban cores. So, and now think of the market pressures and the economic development market opportunities and the economic development imperatives that our urban places face. The market will be there. The importance from a policy standpoint of intensifying and densifying and bringing more life to our streets, more people walking around, more people supporting the scarcer retail, et cetera. And the fact that we will not have to build 1 square millimeter of new parking to serve all of this is an added benefit. And this is a whole topic on its own, but it's something we should really begin thinking about intensively now. So what do we do with this opportunity? And first of all, to sort of quantify it, if you look at some great work that's been done, this country needs, this is 2011 to 2030 data, needs something like 50 million new urban housing units, small lot, single family, multifamily. We're not going to build that many. I wish we could. But basically, that just the development cost of that housing alone represents something like 15 to 20 trillion dollars worth of investment in 20 short years trying to get into cities, not getting your door, trying to get in. This is a tremendous value shift coming into cities. So what we're really talking about today is how do we unlock that value to accomplish the things for our urban communities in cities, as suburbs as well as cities, that we want to. How do we make the places that we want to make? I'm just going to very quickly go through some relatively current examples we're working with. This is a place known affectionately as Marshall's Plaza outside of Boston. This is Roanoke Town Center, showed you earlier. This is a large site in Texas outside of Dallas where these opportunities just exist in great numbers. This is a project I worked on in Tampa that is going to be about 9 million square feet. And frankly, the first major new investment in Tampa, this is right next to downtown Tampa, in more than 3 decades. So what are the thresholds of success? What unlocks this success? Well, it starts with leadership. And that smiling woman there, Eva Galambos, the then mayor of Sandy Springs, Georgia, is the most conservative human being I have ever met. And I say that because I hope everyone on this call realizes this is not about politics, this is about pragmatism. And Eva decided that her community which had privatized city government. There were 5 public employees for Sandy Springs, the population of 70,000. I will comment personally, I don't think that was a good idea from having worked for Sandy Springs. If any of you are thinking of doing it yourselves, don't try this at home. But it's representative of their values. So Eva basically said to her very, very conservative community that was, people thriving in expensive subdivisions and enjoying the suburban life of Atlanta. We need a heart. We need a soul for our community. Not only that, we're going to spend public money to do this, and we're going to take a step beyond that. We're going to use eminent domain to take the key sites to do it. And she brought my old firm and a couple of us in to do a wonderful planning process with a community that, I have to say, to put it politely, was skeptical at the start, but she used her leadership to really help them cover the distance, to go from a community that believed in itself as suburban to now believed in itself as suburban with a soul, a suburb that needed a heart. And in fact, Sandy Springs has dubbed its new center City Springs. Engagement is all about really providing people with the data, the hard information to make not just judgments, but really educated judgments about educated decisions about a very different future than the one that they know. Dublin was in some ways the most successful suburb I've ever worked in. It's outside of Columbus, Ohio. Much of it looks and feels like this. Terrific quality of life. This is their public recreation center. It's hard to find a list of top 10 anything that Dublin doesn't make its way onto in terms of a place to do business or live a good life. So, why worry? And I hope some of you are old enough to remember this. This office buildings and these houses are not the future today, and Dublin saw that. Their HR directors were coming and knocking on the city hall's door and saying, look, we can't keep our employers here. Our employers are the 60,000 folks who work here, support a pretty good life for the 40,000 folks who live here in terms of commercial tax base. We need a downtown. We need a way to attract and retain workforce. So Dublin turned to the places they weren't so proud of, like this, and basically transformed them. Terrific young development firm named Crawford Hoying is responsible for this, into the first 3 million of what will be a probably 10 million or more square foot downtown in a community that, frankly, until 5 or 6 years ago, took its chief pride from the fact that it had more golf courses per square per resident or per acre or whatever, per square mile than probably any other community in the Midwest. This is, and one of the things that Dublin worked very hard at was to make sure that it invested in making this not just a great downtown, but the heart of the community. So part of what emerged is a new Central Park for Dublin. And you can see the impact on fiscal growth. Now, this impact, basically using TIF and tax increment financing, for those of you in the US, that will be familiar. We can explain to the others with question. Unlock the ability to invest in the public goods, in parking, in streets, in the infrastructure of a community that is necessary when you're transforming dying shopping centers and outmoded office parks. Dublin also engaged in transformative planning, and I want to just emphasize, this isn't all Dublin, how much this has to do with really using a lot of data and drilling down into into numbers. So this is transformative planning for a site called South Bay. This is in Boston. It's a big box power center. Those parking lots are being rolled back as this is being rolled in. This work is possible in part because of some really great research into housing markets. A lot of work with the community to help the surrounding residential community understand that while the big box center needed lots of parking, these residents don't. But maybe more to the point, this is that project in Tampa. When we first got involved, it had about 2 million, it was planned for about 2 million square feet. We brought in Lori Volk, who with her husband Todd and son Chris wrote a chapter for this book, who are the preeminent analysts, I think, of emerging and changing housing markets to really drill down into the demographics of Tampa and say, what is the urban market here? And basically, they said that as opposed to 1 to 1.5 million square feet of housing, it was probably more like 3.5 million in 5 to 7 years. Long story short, the development grew quickly to 5 million, is actually now approaching about 9 million square feet. And the ability to understand its real urban potential, and the greater danger is underachieving, not overachieving urban potential today, came from understanding that housing market. One of the things I love about Crystal City and just and across the river from Washington, D.C. is the way they did not give up faced with a very outmoded building stock given today, but have simply gone ahead and pasted 20 to 40 to 60 square feet of retail. I'm grossly oversimplifying things and apologize to any of those of you who were involved, along its streets to really bring a district to life. Shared parking really matters. I don't really have time to go into the details, but I'll say we recently worked on a project in Dallas where the developer came in with 2 million square feet and 5,000 parking spaces. And after about 4 hours left with about 6 hours, I should say, 3 million square feet and 5,000 parking spaces. And it wasn't that we were terribly clever urban designers and able, therefore, to introduce 1,200 units of housing. It's because we really focused on a shared parking strategy as what was wrong with this, the lack thereof, and the ability to support much more vitality, life, 18-7 kind of vitality through the right parking strategy. And of course, understanding how to get started. So this is the Dayton Mall, south of Dayton. This is solid Rust Belt America, a terrific community that cared about itself, did not have a booming economy. In the spirit of time, I'll simply say that there are about 1,200 acres here. Right in the heart of it is something called the Dayton Mall, still relatively healthy mall, but surrounded by more than 1,000 acres of strip retail, et cetera, that was marginal at best. The purple areas represent places where values had dropped. Big boxes were paying the same rent they did today in 2000, and they did in 2085. Holdings were large enough that redevelopment was feasible. Redevelopment driven by demand for new walkable mixed-use lively housing, because this part of Ohio, even if the economy weren't booming, still had a housing mismatch and therefore some pretty vibrant demand. So this is the Dayton Mall changing over time. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. I hope this was useful, and it's been a privilege to talk to you all this morning, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Jason. Thank you, David. I'm going to try and stick as closely as possible to our 1 hour time frame, but I may go a little over, so I appreciate if you stick with us, and if you have any questions, we'll hopefully get to some of those. But today I'm going to talk about placemaking, and particularly in relation to the suburbs. And as we looked at placemaking in the book, there's a couple different ways to look at it. First is from a social aspect, which is basically guided by the belief that the social aspects of the community and personal well-being are of utmost importance. From a physical perspective, placemaking is a good tool for marketing an idea or the act of designing and creating a place where people want to live. We in the book looked at it from both perspectives, which is the act of creating places both from a physical and social perspective, and bringing together a diversity that imparts places of lasting value. But in the dictum of Gertrude Stein, placemaking, as we talk about it in the suburbs, is really about putting the there. As I run through the presentation, I'm going to touch on these key placemaking characteristics, putting focus on the first two, which is related to our mobility. But I'm going to do that within the three realms of urban design. First, those are the streets and circulation, and those refer to the roads, sidewalks, trails, transit. Second is public or open space, which does include private, which it should in most cases. And then finally, talk about just a little bit on building use and architecture. That is the placement, intensity, design, and to a degree, the use of buildings. So first off, in Suburban Remix, we can admit that the book is noticeably short on a larger range of case studies or geographic diversity. We have 8 case studies overall. They do include China and Toronto. What this does do, though, is put a lot of emphasis or focus on the suburbs of the Washington, D.C. region, as David had mentioned, since that is a lot of the suburban retrofits or the urbanization of the suburbs. But we feel that this gives the Suburban Remix room to grow with many more stories to be told from across the country. So we're keeping a tab on that. But moving forward, this is the Washington, D.C. region. 3 of the 8 case studies in the book do focus on suburbs of Washington, D.C. And then also the placemaking chapter that I wrote puts a lot of focus or attention on the area. And then there's a chapter written by Christopher Lineberger on walkable urban places, which helps to set up the book, which does a great job of doing so. But let me first jump into streets and circulation. And as I mentioned, most of the focus is on this aspect, since I would say more than any other aspect, and in conjunction with some of the other realms of urban design, has moved us away from the responsible development practices from our urban early 20th century. As an aside, I would say that millennials, as we track the trends, are more prone to live in suburbs that have a diversity of mobility choices. So as those millennials that David talked about move to the suburbs, it is important to consider and provide a wider range of mobility choices through our policies and standards and whatnot. 2 important considerations within the streets and circulation, and something I'll dive into a little bit more now, is walkability and connectivity. Walkability, basically the ability to walk. So it's the desire, the ease, the comfort of creating a walkable place. And I would say above all, our policies and regulations for the local governments that many of you work in have a really key role to play in creating those walkable urban environments. And then connectivity, and we'll talk about that from both an internal perspective as well as an external perspective, to connect to new development, to the region itself, and to various modes of mobility. The average distance that people feel comfortable walking, as we all know about the quarter-mile walk, so 1 to 3,000 square feet. This is a diagram and some research done by Chris Lineberger that I had mentioned that talks really about where what are the walkability rankings throughout the country. And I will mention that the DC area ranks quite highly in walkability, due in large part to the walkable office and multifamily markets in the suburbs. Las Vegas on here is somewhat of a fluke, since they don't have many walkable places, and that impacted the measurements. But I would say Washington, D.C. and Boston are 2 areas to look at as far as walkable suburbs. The average walkable urban place in the DC region is about 400 acres or so, which is equivalent to 3 regional malls with its parking. And what this does as more malls are retrofitted and more density is added to the suburbs, the malls that exist right now are great land banks for future development, and ones that are particularly look at Denver for that. But these developments typically range from an FAR of 2.0 to 4.0. And just to show a couple examples, these are 2 figure ground document or illustrations from the Washington DC area. Bethesda Row on the left here, you can see the dense or relatively dense urban cores of both developments, and you can see on the edges though that the block structures and the building intensities kind of trickle off into that single-family suburban neighborhood. What you can notice though is the connectivity within, on the right here, for example, in Reston Town Center, it is really a nice configuration of 20 blocks that create a lot of opportunity for and choice for mobility option. And I'm trying to forward my slide. Sarah, can you help forward a slide by chance? I'm locked in.
I don't think I can do it from my end. Let me see. Can you get out of presenter mode and get back in with the PowerPoint?
All right, how is that? Let's try it this way.
Right, sorry for the technical difficulty.
Okay, there we go. I'm sorry. Okay, so thanks for hanging with me. So this is an aerial of Reston Town Center. Reston is a suburb of Washington, DC. And you can see that the demonstration of those city blocks and then various public open spaces. I'll highlight this area here on the right is a transit center that allows mobility around the community and throughout the region.
Oh, I'm going to interrupt you real quick, Jason. I don't think your screen is actually showing. Let me do something really quickly. Sorry about this. I do not know why it did that.
You know?
I'm going to make myself the presenter and then make it you again, and I think that will reset it. Let's see. All right, let's try this. Okay, we're back up.
Okay, so this is Reston Town Center. I'll dive in just a second again. And as far as connectivity is concerned in Reston Town Center, although it has great internal connectivity, there are some connections to the external suburb that are lacking. If you look in the top left image, you can see a plan for a future extension of the town center, which takes advantage of some of the earlier suburban typologies that exist. On the bottom left is a new Reston Gateway development that will connect the town center to a future metro stop. If you look at the map on the right, you can see the metro. So Reston Town Center has really set itself up nicely to have external connectivity that will allow that urban, walkable urban area to grow in the future and to connect to metro transit. Just quickly, this is Reston Town Center again. This is a pedestrian street, and pedestrian streets really can serve as a connecting element internally to a development and a placemaking strategy. What they would do is provide flexibility for programmed events or as an open space within a larger urban design framework. So this is something you're seeing increasingly inserted into or planned for in developments, and that's Reston's. And then this particular one is in Bethesda Row. Don't want to get too far ahead on pedestrian streets, but they do allow some relief and some dedicated space to non-automobile mobility. In planning for a future pedestrian street or promenade, this is Arlington Courthouse Square, a project I worked on in Arlington, the planning of the future government center. And what it does is create the framework that will guide that future retrofit, but it really creates a pedestrian street. You can see a promenade on the left image running north to south. That is that circulatory element, as well as an open space element that ties together adjacent shared streets in the area. So it really gives prominence to pedestrians as the most important component of this area. So this vision and framework really ensures that a walkable urban place will be focused on people and really embrace the cultural amenities within that area, which is important for an authentic suburban walkable experience. This is the Silver Line extension west of Washington, D.C. You can see Tyson's Corner on the right side, Dulles International Airport on the left side. And the Silver Line so far goes out, you can see the green, and it will move beyond into the blue by 2020. So these are going to end up being walkable urban nodes throughout Northern Virginia that connect via Metro Rail and are close to Dulles International Airport. But let me dive into Tyson's just a little bit. Tyson's Corner is about 21, actually Tyson's now, it used to be Tyson's Corner, is about 2,100 acres. It has 90,000 jobs and approximately 19,000 residents, and a total of 36 million square feet of non-residential development. So very quintessential edge city. In the 2000s, a plan was approved for 2050 that will boost this area to 200,000 jobs and over 100,000 residents. So there's a lot of future growth that will need to be accommodated. And to do that, new zoning was adopted concurrent with a 2010 plan that sets the standards for future improvements and addresses development review. One thing to remember in any community that is moving towards walkable urbanism is that policies and guiding principles are important. Simply for Tyson's, it was to transform the Suburban Office Park and Activity Center into a 24/7 urban center. And it is to do that through a strong focus on transit. This is a grid of streets. You can see the current grid on the left side in Tyson's, and then the future 2050 grid. This is for the implementation of the grid. The county board established a mechanism in 2013 that will fund or require $3.1 billion in road and transit improvements. So whereas the county will fund neighborhood and access improvements such as sidewalks, trails, bike bus circular routes, redevelopment will pay for the grid of streets, the grid of streets with contributions that are tied to non-residential space and residential units. So overall, for the implementation of this grid, which is chiefly important to the retrofit of Tyson's, it will be funded 1/2 by redevelopment and 1/2 by taxes in a new Tyson's Transportation Service District. And this is just a picture of Tyson's in 1936. And this is Tyson's in 1993. And for the younger audience, there were color pictures in 93. This, for some reason, is black and white. And 2013, so the face of Tyson's has changed dramatically. You can see the rail running, the Silver Line running through Tyson's here. And then Tyson's today, there's more cranes than anything in Tyson's. And ironically, this picture was taken from close by the National Automobile Dealers Association. All right, so public and open space. This is a picture of Reston Town Center, and it's Fountain Square. And this particular pavilion you see in the center of the picture, at one point, decades ago, was slated to be a cultural amenity such as a museum or a community center. What was important as a temporary solution, this pavilion really gained popularity and was a great host to so many events that over time, Restonians really felt this was the piece that they wanted in the center of the open. So the community came together, saved lots of money, and helped to create a place that was important to them in their open space. Couple key characteristics to keep in mind for a public open space is that it's multi-layered. And by that I mean that there's a range of possibilities that are key to activities that most residents want. Something to remember though is that it should also reflect the tastes and needs of smaller subgroups. Also, a multi-layered public realm really should have meaningful input from community members for the design and programming of the space, as well as the activities that grow out of the space. And you can see here from left to right, there's a variety and multiple layers of opportunities for residents and visitors to the town center. Another aspect to remember is that a open space should be multifunctional. This particular park is in Reston Town Center, about 1¼ acres, and the park itself includes roughly 7 distinct areas within which a variety of activities can take place, and for a variety of ages. So these varying outdoor rooms within this larger open space framework really attract a lot of people and create a great opportunity. And so multifunctional space is something that planners should attempt to achieve to accommodate residents. This is a shot from Pentagon Row in Arlington. It shows a summertime image. This is a Federal Realty development, and this is a winter shot of that same space. Also, multifunction extends to the seasons and keeping up with the activities that people want throughout a year. And then finally, in buildings, use, and architecture, a couple key issues. This is Arlington looking east into Washington, D.C. This is the Roslyn-Ballston corridor. You can see several of the transit villages extending from Virginia Square to Clarendon to Courthouse Square to Roslyn. And this can be really keyed to different intensity levels. This is admittedly much more dense than a typical suburb as it retrofits. But what it does show is how, if you look to the left and right in the image, how you have the density in the middle, but it really scales down and respects the single family and lower density development off to the sides. So something to consider is how you transition these denser urban nodes that are hopefully mixed use to less dense nodes. Here are 2 figure grounds from Arlington, Ballston, and Roslyn on the opposite ends of the corridor. And this is just to simply show that in Ballston, that came up later than Roslyn, there was a greater mix of uses, hence a variety of colors towards the M, the metro stop in the center. And it's important that a wide mix of uses are in and around metro or transit stops so that you can have access for office workers as well as residents. The Roslyn example on the right is very homogeneous in that you see that mauve color, which was all office, which is now being really supported with more residential. But early mistakes, I would say, in the Roslyn area were that it was very homogeneous as far as the land use is concerned, and thus needed more of a mixture of uses to make it a more 18-7 district. And Tyson's, the conceptual land use plan, really learned from that. You look at the, we'll call it periwinkle color around the metro stops, it really calls for a mixed use station, and that there's a greater mix from the very beginning as the development comes up, so that you can support higher densities as well as the use of the transit stations. And then authenticity is one of the final items I want to talk about. And this is an image. Actually, I'll say first that the words authentic and suburb rarely appear in the same sentence together. But as far as it's concerned, authenticity refers to strategies communities can use to capture the local spirit. So this particular image is from Reston in Lake Ann in Reston. Robert Simon is the founder of Reston. You can see his statue there. This is a family enjoying a nice day there in the public art. And I had an opportunity to talk to Robert E. Simon at one point years ago, and he told me a story about, he actually lived in this area and he would walk around it frequently, and told me a story about how he was walking by the statue one day, and there was a family out such as this one outside playing, and the mother was telling the daughter how that's the statue of him. And the little girl looks up to the mom and asks her, how did he get out of the statue? It's these types of authentic public art, or maybe it's programmed events, or it's something that a community can celebrate. Maybe it's architecture or open space, but it's really tapping into the authentic stories and authentic experiences from a community to create that authenticity as suburbs who don't have the authenticity necessarily of the cities that they're attached to, but these suburbs really have an opportunity to create their own authenticity and be that place for the residents of the area. This is Shirlington in Arlington, and Shirlington is authentically Shirlington in that it has many mom and pop shops, restaurants. It's a really good local scene, and it also has a vibrant local theater that they tap into. And then finally, this is Rockville Town Square in Rockville, Maryland. and it has an art and innovation center. It really offers a diverse mix of choices, which is something I would add to those characteristics that suburbs should be looking at as they create walkable urban places. This is really an opportunity for Rockville to celebrate the community through arts and parades and concerts, which is key to the desires of its community members. And so not only is it programmed, but it's also bricks and mortar activity that occur in these spaces. And then with that, I'm going to end. I think I made up some time for us on the end here, but I'll just mention that if you want to contact David or I, or if you want to follow us on Twitter or on Facebook, these are the locations and email addresses. And this, I believe, Sarah, this presentation is available. But finally, I want to say that through Island Press, if you are interested in purchasing Suburban Remix, you can get a $20 or 20% discount code. It's for Remix if you go to Island Press website. It's also available on Amazon. But there is a code available for a discount at Island. But with that, I thank you very much and look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, David and Jason, for presenting with us today. And thank you for everyone who stuck around with us till the end. We do have a couple questions here, and I'll start with the first one, as this may be a big FAQ. Jasmine asks, can we get CM credits for this? Yes, you can. If you're a member of APA and you watched it live today, you can get a CM credit, and that code to log it is on our webinar page of apavirginia.com, and it will also be in the follow-up email going out to all the attendees today. All right, I have a question from Ann Nygaard. She asks, you said local governments play a major role in creating walkable environments. What are the best ways local governments can have an impact?
You can hear me still?
Yes.
Okay. So what I found through my work, and particularly in suburban communities, I'll take Arlington, for example, is we were, as a planning department and as urban designers, we were out in the community really being engaged with the community members, teaching the importance of walkable communities. And the members or the citizens of Arlington were very engaged in community groups. They came out to presentations. They provided a lot of input. The work we did with the community, and then when it came time to adopting plans or getting community input for plans, really paid off in that they understood the importance, but it also came down to we received the community support when it came time to draft policies or standards or guidelines or zoning ordinance amendments that moved the community towards more walkable urban environments. So I would say it's part education on the part of planners, but it's also putting together those policies in conjunction with citizens of a community that really signal the direction the community wants to take. It makes putting those policies in place makes moving towards plans and guidelines that much easier.
This is David. Can you hear me also?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'll just add a quick note. Certainly agree with everything Jason said. I think one of the most important roles that the public sector can play is to be very real about the densities, the programming. These two are closely interrelated, that really unlock walkability. So as we all know, well, first of all, simply a wonderfully paved sidewalk with wonderful tree cover is nice, but it doesn't create walkability. What creates walkability is the animation of the activities along the street, that's along the sidewalk that someone walks by, the chance interactions that these activities foster, the things that make a place a main street in the heart of a community. Well, as we all know, there's less and less retail to go around, thanks to Amazon and a lot of other things going on in our society right now. And the kind of retail that really bring streets to life are generally less mass market, more experiential, sort of cool, smaller retail, the kinds of things that are really brought to life and supported by walkable residential, meaning residential within a 5-minute walk. And these days, probably if a community wants to really bring life to a main street, the single most important thing they can do is try to make sure that their zoning supports and development policies roughly 1,000 housing units within a 5-minute walk of that main street. That more than anything else will provide the foundation that will support the programming that unlocks the ability of design and all the other things that we can do to sort of work their magic.
Okay, thank you. Next, I have a note from Olivier Longville. He says, thanks, great webinar. Just ordered the book on Amazon.
Ah, thank you.
Next question comes from Constance and Eric. They're at Studio CI in Detroit. So thank you for joining us all the way from Detroit. They say, thank you, David and Jason. Excellent webinar. Could you talk a bit about the last mile in urban and suburban mobility? Does it play a role in Suburban Remix?
I'll jump in. Absolutely, yes. Constance, if this is Constance Baguro, hello, and thanks for listening. I think that one of the most important contributions that autonomous mobility, particularly shared autonomous mobility, is going to make is to be able to extend the walk, extend solve the sort of the last mile conundrum, so that if you have transit service to an area, basically a transit vehicle can be connected to shared autonomous vehicles, so that when the train pulls up at the station, so to speak, and people get out, there are a series of SAVs waiting for them that pick them up and take them sort of the last mile to where they want to go. Now, the last mile can, right now, the last mile is probably more like a quarter mile, because that's how much people are willing to walk. The last mile, in fact, could be 2 miles or 3 miles, depending on what a short SAV ride is. So in effect, what that does is take the transit-oriented impact area of the transit-oriented development, transit-oriented district, whatever, impact zone of transit, and extend it from a quarter mile, roughly a 5-minute walk from a transit station, to the service area of the shared autonomous vehicles that can be linked to that station. Now, that means that instead of a quarter mile being an area where you require much less parking, where you can basically enjoy the benefit of rent premiums and therefore more development capability, where folks who can't afford a car have access to transit, these benefits now extend out to a mile or 2 from a transit station.
But I'll add to that too. And in addition to SAV and AVs, we're seeing a lot, especially in DC, Northern Virginia area, seeing a lot of bike share, dockless bike share, and now we're starting to see scooter shares that will, I think, is very promising for covering the first and last mile of a commute. So, so there's multiple mobility options, I would say, that are helping to achieve that.
All these things should be integrated. There's an SAV is going to have bike racks on it. All these things should be interconnected.
I've got 5 more questions. You guys want to keep going?
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. Next question comes from J.C. Douglas, asking or saying, it seems that the driving force behind these re-envisioning of suburban areas is primarily failing economic centers, correct? In one case, you mentioned in Georgia that it was a political influence, or are you finding other drivers from your case studies?
I'll jump in. This is David. It's a very interesting question. It's interesting to hear how we sound. I would say the opportunity takes place in stagnant economic centers, areas that are producing much less value today than they have in the past and are therefore ripe for redevelopment. The driver is community aspiration. It is, particularly in the suburbs. but also in urban areas. People want Main Street. If you look at deep down in all the values changes that we talked about, particularly the shift from homogeneity to diversity, the sort of tremendous longing for community and the chance to really express community that we all have today, all the data that talks about how areas with higher walk scores have more economic value, no matter how you measure it, et cetera. It's all pointing to the same thing, which is the desire that we will invest in to create a heart for our communities and a place that really brings us together, promotes interaction. And if you think about it, the fact that we are growing so much more diverse means there are very pragmatic reasons why it's important that this happen. I'll just throw out one little tidbit. Talked about the challenges around workforce. Well, in addition to a slowing workforce, more than all of the growth in U.S. workforce, North American workforce, is going to be what folks today we call of color. And believe me, they are much more interested in environments that promote diversity, interaction, a sense that everybody is invited and to the table.
All right. Next question comes from Sue Hanchin asking, what do you think are the main reasons that millennials tend to prefer urban places? Examples given: fewer or no children, and tendency to rideshare or take transit.
Jason, you're closer to being one. You want to try that?
Yeah. Boy, that's a whole presentation in and of itself. I would just anecdotally, I would say that the trends and desires of millennials are more in line with an urban future. And part of that is due to millennials shedding the habits of their parents, and that they grew up a lot of them grew up in stagnant suburbs that were really placeless. And in coming out into adulthood, a lot of millennials have sought to move to a more exciting locale and something with more economic opportunity. A lot of the millennials are moving to urban places for jobs, as well as a lot of jobs are moving to urban places to find millennials. So there's kind of a symbiosis there between the economic opportunity as well as the supply that the millennials provide.
The only term I would add once again is diversity. I think that we cannot underappreciate the importance, the fact that we are growing much more diverse, that we all know that we all get this. We understand the importance of embracing diversity, of understanding diversity, of being comfortable with diversity, of getting diversity, and that comes more naturally in diverse urban environments and those that are walkable and sort of promote interaction. And I think what I marvel at talking to people is how much it's not they're afraid of, but they just don't want to be in somebody once described me as a white bread environment that's sort of all them, because it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel the way the world is anymore.
All right, thank you. Next question is from John Matthew asking, are there resources to help us make changes to our land use planning or transportation planning to prepare us for autonomous vehicles?
David?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I apologize.
Sure. Are there resources to help us make changes to our land use planning or transportation planning to prepare us for autonomous vehicles?
Wow, that's a very good question, and I don't mean to duck it at all, but I think the best thing for me to do would be if this individual could send me an email, david.dixon@stantec.com, and maybe we can post a result. What I'm going to do is ask my mobility colleagues who live in this world what resources are available. They're very fragmented. They come from grants as much as they from the nonprofit world, as much as they do from public programs, and certainly from the federal government at this point. in time, but they're going to be able to give you a much better answer. And boy, I think the most important, one of the many absolutely critical things we all need to be out doing as planners right now is out there launching this conversation with our communities and finding some support is important. But please get in touch with me and I'll get you an answer.
And I'll add to John's question that there, and you may have seen this, John, but there are APA has put out a lot of resources in which David was actually part of that. But so APA is quickly pushing out a lot of resources educationally around SAVs and AVs.
I'm sorry, I took your answer as dollars. I mean, your question is dollars.
Oh,
yeah,
resources. Yeah, that's part of the resources, I guess.
Okay. Next question is from Martha Mason. Cannot see the rest of her name, but says a recent article in the Washington Post talks about the decline in transit ridership in U.S. How might this affect urban and suburban remix trends?
Declining transit ridership in the U.S.?
Yes.
I think there's been a lot of sort of press on this. I'm not sure if it's as real as it appears to be, but and generally it's associated with the impact of, well, two things: the impact of Uber, Lyft, rideshare services, which are frankly another form of transit, more as ride sharing, much and because they're related to an app in a way that taxis have never been. And to lack of investment, particularly in New York City, which is our premier system. There are a number of urban systems that are actually doing very well, but New York City is really underinvested in its system. I think what this points out to more than anything else is the need, the opportunity to really look at how we integrate all our modes. Right now, each mode is sort of its own story. But each trip is not a series of stories about modes. It's a story about where we want to get to and the best way to get there. Excuse me. And we have an opportunity coming up with the sort of fundamental, radical technological shifts that we're about to experience, where we can get ahead of this curve and really integrate our whole mobility system. Jason, do you want to add?
No, I'm wondering if Martha's quite, I think I saw the same Washington Post article, and I think it's particularly salient in the DC area because of the mechanics issues with Metro here.
Oh, sorry.
And I don't know the specifics of that article off the top of my head, but it is pretty salient in this area. And I would also say, though, I'd like to see the statistics, but I think a lot of if there is a decrease in transit ridership, it could be due to a number of factors: people walking, people biking, people working from home. So there's probably a larger story to be told. But I like, David, your response in really tying all of these together is important in how they work together.
It is not a shift back to single occupancy vehicles.
Correct.
All right, and the very last question we have comes from Ann Nygaard again. She asks, how is the Tyson's grid implemented? What local government requirements are being put in place as blocks redevelop?
I don't know if I heard the question out of that. How is the Tyson's plan being implemented?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'll repeat it. How is the Tyson's grid implemented, and what local government requirements are being put in place as blocks redevelop?
Okay, so on a high level, I can't get too much into detail. I'm not in the mechanics of it, but I know as development occurs in Tyson's, I mentioned how that funding for the grid of streets is coming from both a tax district as well as a fee placed on residential units and non-residential square footage. So as the developments occur in Tyson's, and this is going to be a long transition, over the next 30, 40 years. So it will be piecemeal, but as these developments come up in Tyson's, each development will be essentially responsible for the segments of the grid adjacent to them. It may be a little more difficult than that. for example, as pieces of the grid are completed and someone comes up on the other side of the street, well, they put money into a kitty or a fund that will help them. But essentially, it's as development occurs, the grid of streets is being implemented in Tyson's.
Alrighty. Well, I think that just about wraps it up for today. Again, thank you to everyone who stuck with us through the end here. And thank you for Jason and David for presenting with us today. I think this was a great presentation, and hopefully all the listeners will walk away with some new ideas. Do you have anything else to add, Jason and David?
No, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. We appreciate it. Thank you for listening, everybody.
I just add my thanks also. Really appreciate everyone taking the interest and the time to do this.
Thank you so much, and look out for the follow-up email for all the attendees. Make sure to log your CM credit and register for next month's webinar on April 16th. And we will talk then. Everyone have a great Monday.
Bye.